Committee in third reading.
Dr David Clark, a 10-minute call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. There's been underinvestment by National in research and development. Less than 1% of GDP compared to Denmark and Finland with about 3 to 4% of GDP. We know the OECD average is around 2.5%. This woeful underinvestment in R&D is something this government is doing nothing to address. The National chose, of course, to cut the R&D tax credits that Labor put in place, and they've also slashed budgets in other areas, and it goes to show that they just don't get it. You know, they just don't get it. There's some issues they just don't get. There's also a woeful underinvestment in private sector R&D, which is linked to the public sector R&D investment, as is shown across the OECD. The bureaucratic subsidy approach that National favours doesn't even fit with their language of business-friendly, business-led approach. It's unfortunate. That's all you can say about it. A whole lot of red tape, a slow way of doing business, and it doesn't really encourage those who are the innovators in our society, who want to take it forward, who want to make sure that there are high-paying, high-skilled, high-tech manufacturing jobs for the future ahead of us. We saw with the emissions trading legislation that we just debated before this bill that instead they are busy preoccupying themselves with taking the country backwards by extending subsidies for the businesses that are not in the high-tech space. And that paints a picture of a government that has its eye off the ball, that doesn't have a plan for this country for taking our industries forward. Mr Woodhouse opposite is talking about sunset industries. No doubt he's including in there Hillside and Dunedin. The Fisher and Paykel probably, who shut down their manufacturing, would be a sunset industry to Mr Woodhouse, I suspect. He doesn't care that the jobs are going in Dunedin. He doesn't care that Tamahini Knitwear shut down. He doesn't care that the jobs went at Delta. He doesn't care that the IRD is shutting down its local services, that the taxpayer money that goes into Dunedin is being taken out so that there is an increase in unemployment locally. These are foolish things to argue, Mr Woodhouse. The local situation in Dunedin is dire and the unemployment levels are rising. And it's because of policies like this one we see before us, which really is not favourable to businesses that are wanting to innovate, but instead makes it more complicated. Look, it would be a good thing as a part of a wider package, and it is a timid step in the right direction. So ultimately, although it's a slightly bitter pill, Labor will be supporting this legislation because we think this kind of thing can be built on. If we did have decent R&D tax credits, if we had some joined-up policy, if we had decent procurement policies, if we took care of the bigger picture, we looked at the kind of macro-prudential tools that the Reserve Bank might need to ensure that we actually had jobs and a thriving economy and an exchange rate that was favourable to our manufacturing export sector, if we had pro-growth tax policy, the likes of a capital gains tax that would see money flowing from the speculative sector toward the productive sector, if we had procurement policies that actually looked at the whole economy. You know, when the Hillside trains were to be built, if we looked at the wider economic benefit, it might have been a very different equation. If we looked at the tax paid by those people who were doing the manufacturing, who had the jobs, if we looked at the money going to those industries that provide work into Hillside, the other engineering firms, if we looked at the wider benefits to our country of having a capable manufacturing sector, we might have had a different outcome. So the R&D tax policies, of course, are the critical one in this context, but those other things cannot be ignored because they are about ensuring that we do have economic development in New Zealand. Now, I mean, to come back to that point, John Key did promise 170,000 new jobs, and today, just today, we have the highest jobless rate in 13 years, Mr Speaker, the highest jobless rate in 13 years. 175,000 people looking for work. It hasn't been this bad since Bill English was last Finance Minister in the 90s. Things haven't been this bad. The only common element, I guess, we can see there very plainly. So this timid approach to innovation, which sees this underinvestment, is part of a bigger picture, and it is also in some ways explained by the way this bill has been put through. We in the Labour Party believe that if you want to get good policy that supports industry, that supports commercialisation, that supports the scientific community, and that actually builds our economy, you need proper input from industry. You actually have to be willing to listen to the businesses that are doing this stuff. Not ramming it through at high speed, not putting it through a blink and you miss it select committee process. You need to be looking at that bigger picture, of course, the overvalued currency and the tools that would address that, the other things that are going on in the New Zealand sector that are leading to the job losses that this government is overseeing, the current decline in the economy, the drop in real wages, in median wage of 3% recently announced. Those things all need to be taken into account when you're setting the policy. But this process hasn't helped. Speeding this through the Select Committee doesn't give industry, the scientific community and economic development communities and members of the public the opportunity to make the contributions they can make that would actually make sure that we had proper, decent policy in this area. Even if the government doesn't have a vision for it, that Select Committee process is an opportunity to get input from those that do. So the high-tech manufacturing sector, jobs, skills and so on should also be given an explicit focus in this bill. This is what one of the submitters, or one of the few submitters who was allowed to come along in the time frame or was able to, made a point, and we support this, that those objectives of having a high-tech manufacturing sector for increasing jobs and increasing skills should be given an explicit focus in the bill. Why not make it clear that that's what we're trying to achieve with this, so that then questions can be asked if it's not being achieved, so that we can actually have accountability measures and a clear focus. So likewise, in the purpose statement, it'd be great, it'd be crucial that there not be unnecessary duplication and competition with pre-existing research provision by the ATI. So why not make that explicit in the legislation? Again, submitter, there were some who were able to make the tightened timeframes, made that point, and Labor agrees with that. You know, there are sensible and serious things that could have been included to improve the economic prospects associated with this initiative that were not taken into account. Another aspect, another conflict which sits in this bill is the funder-provider split. Now, this is something that fits into basic public sector management principles. The funder-provider split is something you can ask the Treasury about. They'll wax lyrical about the importance of making sure that there is not a conflict between those who are bidding into the process and those who have got the funding. And so, you know, that exists with the active functions of the ATI, the research and development and knowledge and transfer functions, technology transfer functions, and the enabling functions, the funding to third parties, Mr. Speaker. And then we also note that there were very few submissions from industry and businesses directly engaged in high value manufacturing, and that has got to be a concern.
They hardly had time to do it.
Well, they didn't have time to do it, as my colleague, the Honourable Trevor Mallard, points out. And that means that we're likely to get flawed legislation, that we're not going to get legislation that could be achieving to the extent that is possible if the proper processes of this Parliament are observed and the habits of good parliamentary conduct. Labor also thinks that the education sector could be quite directly tied in, so that, again, the advice and so on that's coming in takes account of that wider context. Look, these are all things that were overlooked. On its own, the ATI cannot successfully transform our economy. It could be better, but overall, it fits within a wider context where the government has its eye off the ball. It does not have a plan. It's not taking care of those bigger picture issues, the exchange rate that makes it very difficult for the manufacturing sector. That's why we're seeing those engaged in manufacturing drop off, the lowest numbers since statistics began. We learnt yesterday in the manufacturing sector. And that's why, you know, if you don't pay attention to those things, if you don't have pro-growth tax policies that support industries, if you don't have simplified business practices, if you're not actually looking out and listening to what's going on more broadly, and you're not willing to make the big changes to get our economy back on track, it won't happen. This government doesn't have a plan. It is overseeing the worst economic record of any government in 50 years. It potters along, it's not making the difference, and Mr Woodhouse, I look forward to hearing what he has to say about how this is going to be turned around, because there's no evidence it is in the current settings.